I've said before in private that I think that a life of solitude can be just as meaningful as any other, but that we need other people to bounce our ideas off of, to sate our fears that our life might not be meaningful and make sure that we're sane, to keep us connected to our surroundings and give our isolated thoughts the proper context. Other people aren't what give meaning to your life, instead they serve as a sort of philosophical checkpoint. No matter how independent you are, without other people in your life you may as well be dead, sitting on a cloud philosophizing to yourself with no audience. What good is an idea if it never comes to fruition and ultimately dies with you? You could have the most meaningful life possible, but without other people around you would never know it. There's an inherent fear behind connecting with people, and it all stems from that not knowing. What if my ideas are terrible and my life meaningless? If you're eating dinner alone every night and thinking to yourself, you could either be in blissful or horrific ignorance of how much meaning your life has. And the only way to know which one it's been is to end that ignorance and connect with the world. There will be in-game spoilers for Death Stranding from here on out. That moment of stepping out of the shadows and merging yours with the social consciousness is what Death Stranding is all about. However, it isn't healing if you don't start broken. Every major character in Death Stranding has a powerful connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Deadman, for instance, was never truly born. He was grown in a test tube and stitched together with parts that were 70% acquired from dead bodies. He has no ka, no soul. As a result, he spends all his time working with and trying to understand the dead. He even worked in a morgue before the events of the game. As a result of this, he's less able to forge connections in the world of the living. The strongest example of this is the BBs. He's become so used to life and death intermingling that he only sees them as tools, not as living humans who had their souls stolen from them. He's so controlled by his lack of a soul that he isn't even able to empathize with the one group of people who also have no souls in their bodies. Maybe he's just jealous of them. Sure, they were never born, just as he wasn't, but they still have a soul to some degree. And through their separation with it, they can easily comprehend the beach, a world that Deadman spent his entire career trying to comprehend. Whether it's jealousy or apathy that drives this behavior, Deadman's obsessive and manufactured connection with the dead makes him socially awkward to an incredible degree, and unable to connect with anybody for the vast majority of the game. For a contrary, but parallel example, let's look at Fragile. Fragile suffers from Doom's level 3, and as a result is able to travel to any beach she's able to set her mind to. And through the exploits of Fragile Express, she became an incredibly sociable person, doing more to reconnect the preppers of the world than even Bridges 1 was able to. However, this power of hers eventually attracted the attention of the once sane Higgs. I won't get too into his character yet. He was a good man at one point, but he wanted to have a true connection between life and death, and essentially become a god, hence the name. I may as well point out now that the Higgs boson is also known as the God Particle. Anyways, he used Fragile's powers to get a better understanding of the beach and the connection between the world of the living and that of the dead, and they became partners. However, eventually he was attracted to Bridget's much greater power, and in an attempt to please her, he tricked Fragile into destroying Middle Knot City.
Why did you do it? Why did you betray me?
Because I found someone who completes me.
Which caused her to be much less trusting and ruined all the connections she had made up until then. In simpler terms, Fragile's power to travel to the beaches at will, her connection between life and death, ultimately led to her not being willing to go out and make connections again, until Sam eventually helps her out of that. To round things off, let's look at one last supporting character, and see how this connection to death led them to living a less fulfilling life as well. We'll take a look at Hardman, a character who, in being the most human, is in fact the odd one out when compared to the rest of the cast. Up until the last section of the game, Hardman never had been to the beach, and had a sort of designed isolation from the concept of death. He had been in countless near-death experiences during the Middle East conflicts before the Stranding, but each time he was saved by Cliff Unger. This led him to seeing himself as an action hero, someone who's immortal. As such, he didn't have a connection with death in the same way that every other character does.
Look at us. A bunch of deathless freaks meeting like this.
He hadn't actually been to the realm of the dead, but his feelings about how he related to it led to a similar outcome as the other characters. Whereas characters like Hardman and Malignia Locke had a full understanding of what it was like to die, and as a result saw the afterlife as having just as much meaning as life, negating their fear of death and their urge to make as much of their mortal life as possible, Hardman felt immortal, and as a result didn't fear death, and didn't feel the need to make much of his mortal life. This feeling of immortality is what drove him to making the heroic but ill-advised decision to let Cliff Unger take his son out of the isolation ward and try to run away from Bridges with him. Ultimately, this led to Cliff and his son's death, followed by the son being given the gift of repatriation by Bridget. Hardman felt responsible for what happened to Cliff and his son, and as a result he donned a mask and chose to live a life of secrecy, trying to hide what he did from Sam, Cliff's son. As a result of this secrecy, we spend the latter half of the game convinced that Hardman is going to turn out to be the villain of the game, and he doesn't get the chance to forge a connection with us like the other characters were able to. He had no fear of death, just like all the other characters, and so he never felt the urge to make the most of his life. For the others, losing their lives was just as meaningless as living it, but for Hardman, losing his life wasn't even a possibility. If you either can't die or don't see it as being any worse than living, why rush to make connections in the mortal world? I could continue to list off characters and draw parallels between their stories and these, but instead I'll leave that for you all to discover as you play and replay the game. Suffice it to say, every major character has a strong connection between the world of the dead and that of the living, and as a result, they're metaphorically hesitant to make connections in the real world. As the game says multiple times, living in isolation is no different than being dead, and these characters have essentially chosen to be dead through their connections with the beaches. All of these characters are stranded on their beaches, either metaphorically as in Hardman, Deadman, Higgs, or Fragile, or literally as in Hartman, Cliff Unger, Mama, and Amelie Bridget, who we'll just call EE, Extinction Entity, from now on. They're all stuck on their beaches, worlds made entirely in their own mind in one way or another, and it's going to take Sam Bridges, the one man who can freely move between life and death, to build a bridge between their isolated worlds and the rest of reality. I don't want to dwell on this next reading of the game, so I'll spread it thin over the course of the entire video, as there's a lot more to Death Stranding than autobiographical symbolism. Hideo Kojima could also be said to have been in a similar place to all these supporting characters at the beginning of the game. Having essentially been forced to work exclusively on one series, Metal Gear, for almost his entire career, you could say that he was stuck in this small world that he had built for himself. Metal Gear can be seen as Kojima's beach, and his airtight connection with it isolated him from the rest of the world, in his case the world of creative opportunities that lie outside of the Metal Gear series. More on that later. These beaches represent the whirlpool of isolated thoughts that exist in everyone's head. That's why everyone's beach is created based on what's in the owner's mind. They represent the meaningful but impossible to quantify lives of all these isolated people. Again, you can live an isolated life that's just as meaningful as any other, but you'll never know how meaningful it was until you connect those isolated ideas with those of the rest of the world, and this is where Sam Porter Bridges fits into all of this. In the beginning of the game, Sam seems like the most isolated character of them all. He has a bad case of aphenphosmphobia, which causes him to literally break out into hives whenever he's touched. He shows complete apathy for his adoptive mother's life wishes for him, and the game even visualizes her in a terrifying way, as she crawls onto him just to say,
I love you, Sam.
He doesn't take Fragile up on any of her offers of cryptobiotes, and honestly, the only real connection he seems to have with any of the characters so early in the game is Amelie and his BB, and I suspect that that's only because he can empathize with it, seeing as he too was a BB at one point. Well, here's the thing about Sam. He is isolated, but he isn't stuck that way. He has the ability to connect to other people, and eventually himself. This is because, while Sam does have a connection to the afterlife through Amelie, that connection is on borrowed time, and will eventually fade away, leading him to seek mortal connections.
Amelie. Is French for soul. A soul that's a lie.
As a BB, he already had a loose grip on his soul, and when he was killed as a baby, EE gave him the gift, or the curse, of repatriation. With this, he had lost his soul entirely, and is continually rejected by death over and over for the duration of the game. His corpse can't go necro, causing a void out, but he has more cause to be afraid of death than any of our other characters, and that he knows for a fact that when he eventually dies for good, when all of humanity dies for good, he'll face true death as atheists see it, with no way to move on to the afterlife, or even just be stranded on the beach. It's worth reminding you all now that the beach isn't the afterlife, it's simply where your soul goes after it separates from your body, and it acts as a sort of bridge between mortal life and the afterlife. Since Sam's soul has already gone on to the afterlife, he'll just cease to exist when he finally dies for good. No beach, no afterlife, just nothing. So once he realizes humanity, and therefore his once presumed immortal self, is doomed, he becomes the character who fears the end of his body more than any other, and has cause to want his true life to be as meaningful as possible. The pressure of a limited amount of time in existence urges him to go out and make those connections, to bounce himself off of other people to gauge whether or not he's spending his life the correct way. Whether you want to look into Sam's condition so literally or not, by the time it's clear that humanity is soon going to be extinct, Sam wants to have lived a meaningful life. The time pressure of humanity ceasing to exist is what drives him. And at that point in the game, when it's revealed that every human, except for him, is soon going to be in the afterlife, he's the only one with such a weak connection to the afterlife that he truly cares how his mortal life is spent. However, as I said, even Sam isn't completely without a connection to the afterlife. The closest thing to a soul that Sam has is his connection to Amelie, EE's soul. She, and the doom sufferers that she's created, are the only reason Sam will ever see a beach, and this is what drives him to connect America in the beginning of the game, finding Amelie again, the one entity that might be able to give him a true death, or at least give him some closure in regards to the end of his life. He starts out apathetic, but not completely apathetic. He still cares about Amelie. His loose but important connection to the afterlife does drive him to the same self-destructive isolation that other characters suffer from. Sure, it causes him to connect America again, but he doesn't actually care about America, and he doesn't truly connect himself to the world until he learns that Amelie is a lie, and that there can be no beach or afterlife for him once humanity is finished. Once he realizes this, his connection to the afterlife is severed, and he starts to value his mortal life and his personal connections again, just in time for the end of the game. So what's the point of all of this? Well, again, it's the fear of finding out the value of one's own life. Most of us believe that we either have a limited amount of time to exist, or that the afterlife is so different from ours that it isn't even comparable. So we'd better make use of that mortal time we've been given. How valuable is your life? You may already have a good answer, but I'm sure you figured that out by looking at and talking to other people, making connections. If you're holed up alone, sitting inside your own mind, eating dinner by yourself every night, you might have a valuable life, or you might not. There's no way to know until you make connections and use other people to find out. If we knew that being dead wouldn't be all that different from being alive on a moment-to-moment basis, we wouldn't really feel the pressure of wanting a valuable life. But since we don't know what death holds, the fear of not being able to evaluate our lives drives us to connect with other people. It's incredibly scary to take that plunge and run the risk of reaching out to the rest of the world only to realize that your life hasn't been all that valuable. But because of that extinction opportunity, figuring out how valuable your life has been is much less scary than not knowing. So, to put it simply, the constant threat of death is what urges us to make connections with others, so that we can more objectively evaluate our own life. This is what I call the extinction opportunity. Throughout this game, Sam, through acting as a contrary example, teaches the other characters that you can value your own life, even if you're confident that death will just be the next stage of existence. Sam's emptiness teaches them how much better it is to be full. He forges connections all over America, but he doesn't care about it one bit. It's just a means to an end for him, that end being reconnecting with his soul, reconnecting with Amelie. However, once he realizes that he faces eventual extinction, he starts to really live. As for the other characters, Sam's inability to ever pass on to the next stage of existence urges them to care more about their mortal lives. They may treat it as just a stepping stone between birth and the afterlife, but that stepping stone is all that Sam will ever have, and if he can make do with just that mortal life, maybe they should learn to appreciate it more. The Death Stranding separated America literally, sure, but metaphorically, it was the connection to the world of the dead that really caused the separation. It caused the Death Stranding. Humanity learned that dying isn't as bad as it might have seemed, so there was no longer any pressure to truly live. However, the only reason that Sam ever went on his journey that taught everybody this is because of that extinction opportunity. From a more ludological perspective, this also ties in with how we interact with other players. Every interaction we have with each other in this game stems from adversity, a fear of failure that leads us to making a couple of friends along the way. When I finished the game, in the final credits I saw a list of every player I connected with over the game, and many of them were players who I recognized for their helpful actions. Whoever you are and whatever your story is, I'll never forget you, Dr. Pervert. I'll never forget that generator that you left behind for me when I needed it most. It recharged my speed skeleton, and as a result I was able to run away when these BTs managed to catch me. The mystery behind death can be said to be the whole point of it as a driving force for evolution. If you suddenly realized what death held for everybody and it wasn't all that bad, then you would be tempted to just waste your life. Once humanity realized that death is just a bridge between two equally valid stages of existence, they did just that, started wasting their lives. Sam, however, is the only one that faces true extinction. Sure, humanity might go extinct in the physical world, but they'll live on in the afterlife. Sam, on the other hand, has cause to really care that humanity is on the way out. If they all die, he dies, only he doesn't get to move on to the afterlife. So, while Sam initially thinks he might be able to really do something with his life by reconnecting with the only soul he ever truly knew, Amelie, he does this in a desperate bid to find some sort of afterlife for himself. Sure, through Amelie, he still has a connection to death in the beginning of the game, like the other characters, but he knows that it isn't a permanent one. And so, in spite of that connection to death, he still fears death, causing him to step out of the shadows, outside of his own mind, and figure out if he can get some meaning out of his life. The threat of an unknown death causes us to seek out connections, but back to the more meaningful piece of the game's main metaphor, seeking out those connections is still scary. Not as scary as dying without having made them, but scary nonetheless. Again, what if you start making connections with people only to find out that they've all been living much more meaningful lives than you were? It'd be devastating. Well, for the majority of the game, in which you're connecting America, this concept of fear of connections is represented by 4 different entities: Bridges, Higgs, the Supercell, and of course the risk of causing a second Death Stranding. The risk of a second Death Stranding is self-explanatory. The first one was caused by our attempts to meddle with the beach, and the chiral network is entirely dependent on the beach. But let's cover those others in order, starting with Bridges. From the moment that Sam woke up with his cufflink, and up until the last 2 or so hours of the game, I was convinced that Bridges was going to turn out to be a corrupt, evil organization. This fear was encouraged by tons of scenes in the game, such as when Deadman coaxes us to get into the shower with him, and says,
"No one can spy on us in here. It's just you and me."
And tells us that he's getting more and more suspicious of Hardman's mysterious past. This note of people telling us not to trust Hardman is hit multiple times over the course of the game, and from the moment we meet him, we already have a bit of distrust for him. Why does he wear the mask? Really, Hardman is the seed which all of this distrust in Bridges comes from. However, we also see plenty of these BB flashback scenes in which Bridges' staff can clearly be seen manipulating and lying to Cliff Unger about what's going to happen to his child. And in the third act, we start wondering if we can even trust Bridget and Amelie, who we still don't know are one and the same, when Higgs takes us aside and tells us that he isn't the only one wearing a mask, and says that the girl is too, referring to Amelie.
I'm not the only one wearing masks either. There's your boss man, and that woman.
We have no idea what this means at this point in the game, but it just furthers our distrust. Plus, on a grander scale, we constantly come across Americans who don't want to rejoin America, and want nothing to do with Bridges, until we eventually convince them, for better or worse, to join up. Throughout our entire time reconnecting America, we're wondering if what we're doing is right, and it's not just our distrust in Bridges that this stems from. Our distrust in the chiral network also feeds into it. I don't know about you all, but more so than Bridges' mysterious motivations, I was certain that even if the chiral network didn't prompt a second Death Stranding, it would enable Higgs and his terrorists to easily wipe out any cities they saw fit. Not only would it help them to track down Amelie, if the story we were fed in the beginning was true, but it would also give them full access to so much of the UCA's technology. They would become just as powerful as the UCA overnight. Then there's the supercells, the terrible storms that sweep Sam and Deadman into Cliff's beach multiple times. The whole reason Cliff still exists in the beach and hasn't moved on to the afterlife is because of his regret for what he did to his child. It binds him to this world as closely as physics will allow, and through the chiral network he's able to reach through, beyond the beach, and pull things in from the real world, exactly as the BTs do. Those supercells, they have to be Cliff's doing. The chiral network works by sending data through various beaches, where time is effectively subjective. That's how holographic communication can be done with zero latency. The beach actually sends the data back in time. Well, with the expansion of the chiral network, America is slowly surrounded more and more by the beach, which is a major part of why BTs are so much more common by the end of the game. In the same way that dozens of radio, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other types of signals are passing through your body as you hear this, the chiral network is passing through all of America by the end of the game. And so, a force on the beach, made powerful by regret, Cliff, was able to create a series of incredibly destructive storms in our reality. Any way you spin it, the chiral network is incredibly dangerous. We even see these 5 figures on Amelie's beach in the beginning of the game, which of course represent the Big Five. They're the previous extinction entities that led to the 5 largest extinctions in Earth's history. They're just watching over us, furthering this idea that the beach is dangerous and might lead to our extinction. But that's kind of the point. Risking your neck is an uncomfortable but essential part of making connections, both in-game and in reality. After all, what if you make those connections only to realize that your life was meaningless? A horrifying thought, and one that keeps so many people, both in real life and in the metaphor of the game, from reaching out to the people around them and letting themselves grow and change with the rest of society. I think that this is something that even the most sociable among us can relate to some degree. Whether it's something as simple as asking out someone you have a crush on, or calling your parents to tell them how much they mean to you, it's scary, difficult, and uncomfortable to reach out beyond you, and step out of your own mind, out of your own beach, even if that beach is an awful place to be stranded. This is where I'll bring up that autobiographical metaphor again. I won't pretend to know what goes on in Kojima's head, but I can only imagine that it was absolutely terrifying to finally step away from the Metal Gear series and move on to greener pastures. Again, I see Metal Gear as being Kojima's beach, this place he created for himself, built out of what goes on in his mind. But it's a prison, and since he wanted to show himself to the world and rebuild those lost connections, he needed to destroy his connection to the beach. This is more or less the same arc that Sam goes through, rebuilding America but being stuck in his own head due to his connection with Amelie's beach, but eventually learning to abandon that connection and focus on what's real, and joining the rest of us in the world outside of the limited scope of Metal Gear. Even though it's something that Kojima has seemingly wanted to do for over a decade and a half, moving on from Metal Gear and showing another side of himself must have been terrifying, and to some small degree I can absolutely relate. Not all of my videos get all that personal, but some of them absolutely do, and it's always even more intimidating than just wondering if my ideas aren't any good. However, the benefit of getting personal in them vastly outweighs the fears I might have, because again, by putting that stuff online, even if nobody comments on it, I'm able to see parts of myself from another person's perspective. So, in that Planescape Torment video, when I admitted that I've cheated on somebody, I felt like I seriously grew as a person. I thought I'd already come to terms with that truth about myself, but by making it public, I forced myself to face that truth a second time. This ultimately led to me calling the person I cheated on and finally telling them, a confession that I think finally gave both of us some closure in regards to the sloppy ending to our relationship, even if I was years too late. We reminisced on parts of our relationship that we had both forgotten about, and ultimately we had a fun conversation, even if it might prove to be our last one. This essay isn't meant to be about me, or even Kojima, but what happened in the story above fits perfectly into one of the most interesting parts of Death Stranding. The threat of extinction urges us to make connections to survive, and then those connections turn out to be fun. Which, as Ludens fan will tell you, makes us Homo Ludens, connecting the world together and helping us to co-evolve through metaphorical acts of play. Believe me when I say that these connections were a hell of a lot of fun. I'm of course talking about the multiplayer component to the game, where we can leave supplies, ladders, ropes, vehicles, and all sorts of other things behind to make the trail a bit easier for the next people who come along. I'd like to think that I'm a pretty selfless person, but this game's design made me into a complete angel. I would spend hours upon hours in this game building roads, zip lines, and all sorts of other things just to make the trail easier, and possibly even more fun for the next guy. Here's some jump cut footage of one of those missions of mine. This box cannon with a waterfall running through it was just begging to have a zipline running up it, so that players could get to the top of the mountain in a matter of seconds, making the journey to Hardman's lab at least 50 times easier. And so I did this absolutely suicidal climb. In fact, the climb did kill me once. Eventually, I was out of ladders, and I thought I would be able to climb this rock here, but it was just a bit too high. I tried to climb it for a while, but eventually I conceded, and when I thought I was going to have to go back to the distro center to fabricate more ladders, I saw this one left behind by some other player. That one last ladder was all that I needed to make it to the top of the cliff and proudly erect my zipline, knowing that my small sacrifice of 40 minutes or so would save countless people so much time. I didn't even do it for the likes. Ziplines hardly get any likes since you can't like them while using them, but that feeling of knowing that someone is following in your footsteps and is thanking you in the back of their head is just so magical. A couple hours earlier, I created that ski lift that you guys might have seen in that little extra I uploaded. There was only one point in the whole game that ski lift was actually beneficial to me in completing my orders, but myself and hopefully at least one other person got to have ourselves a bit of fun with it. And building that thing was no easy task. I had to climb that entire mountain more or less on foot, while carrying 4 or 5 PCC level 2s and of course a hovering cargo holder to use as a snowboard. And to cap it all off, I did all of this roughly an hour before I got the all-terrain skeleton, which would have made the climb drastically easier. But regardless of all of that, and regardless of how few likes I ultimately got on my ziplines, I thought it was a lot of fun, and it's rewarding to think that someone else might have had fun with it too. Again, these are connections that the gameplay naturally had me forging in order to help me deal with Extinction, and those connections turned out to be a lot of fun. Which, as any Homo Ludens will tell you, is all the meaning that any life needs. This is that Extinction opportunity at play again. The fear of failure drives us to make the most of our successes, and this is how we can find meaning in our life on Earth. Just by making the most of it, building connections, seeing how good or bad our ideas are, and having some fun along the way. That's what marrying and having kids is all about, that's why we date and make friends, and that's exactly what this channel is doing for me. But again, making those connections is terrifying. It just so happens to be less terrifying than outright failure. A small bit of that fear of exposing yourself to the world was captured ludologically through this connection system as well. I remember seeing those signs and bridges that would somehow get tens of thousands of likes and suddenly become a little bit insecure about the structures and signs that I was building. I actually caught myself thinking, oh, I'm warning people of BTs ahead, how original. A small part of my brain was actually trying to convince me that I was wrong for doing something that I knew was right. In fact, I even felt like a bit of a loser from time to time when I would take 10 seconds out of my day to spam an especially helpful structure or encouraging sign with as many likes as I could. I would think to myself, man, this guy who made the structure is going to think Leadhead Online was a desperate weirdo. And the same thing would happen with my rope or ladder placements. I knew that there were at least a couple points in the game where I saw somebody's ladder placed in a weird spot, and I would just be left scratching my head, wondering what on earth was going through their mind when they put it there. And sure enough, this led me to wondering if people would look at me that way when they saw some of my more desperate ladder placements. If I messed up and placed it in a wholly unhelpful spot, I even tended to dismantle the ladder so that people wouldn't laugh at me, or even get themselves hurt trying to follow in my ill-advised footsteps. At the end of the day, I knew that this was just my caveman overprotectiveness talking, and that my liking people's work, or warning about BTs with a wholly unoriginal sign, would make somebody happier along the way. But I still had that tiniest bit of reservation about putting myself out there to make the world a better place. I mean, there was even this one point when I was approaching the tar belt that I'm actually pretty proud of, but without the context of knowing exactly what was going on in my head, other players will probably see what I left behind and think I was just being stupid. This river here was just a bit too deep for me to cross, and too wide for me to lay a ladder down from one side to the other. So I tried laying down a ladder that would at least pass over the deep parts, but sure enough, when I got over the deep part, the water's current knocked me off of the ladder, causing me to float downstream and lose my gear. So my solution was to go roughly 25 meters upstream, and put down a rope, making sure that it would reach both my side of the stream and the opposite side, and I held onto the rope while I crossed the ladder, keeping me from being knocked off of it by the current. In my head, this was a clever little bit of engineering, but sure enough, before I crossed the river, I browsed the selection of signs to see if there was anything I could put up that might explain how to use my contraption, and there wasn't, so I still felt the tiniest bit insecure about it. That's a complex set of emotions to have stirred up from the emergent properties of 3 very simple game mechanics, but what's more impressive is that situations like this, entirely abstractly, managed to push me through a similar version of the same character arc that so many of the supporting characters go through. Learning to step out of my own head, off my own beach, and connect with the world. Being insecure about what society might think of me, but knowing that at the end of the day I was being a good person and making the world a better place, and finding meaning for my actions through that knowledge. This applies in a more literal way too, regarding how players help you more so than how you help them. So again, we spend the majority of the game convinced that building the chiral network is dangerous, and will lead to the complete extinction of mankind, but nonetheless we keep on making those connections, and every time we expand the chiral network, we see a ton of people's handiwork suddenly appear in an area that was previously off the network. Every accommodation left by players, be it a sign, a footpath, a bridge, or anything else, helps us out, sure, but they're all emblematic of the damage that we're doing by building the chiral network here. It feels great to slowly tame this harsh landscape with the help of all the other players you're connected to, but when you see a mountainside dotted in ziplines that somebody else made, you're invariably reminded that this is only possible because of the chiral network, the thing that threatens to destroy your save file in a manner of speaking, and separate you from the rest of these players, destroying all your connections. Not unlike how the complete extinction of humanity will eventually separate Sam from every other human, seeing as he's one of the only ones who's not going to get his own beach and move on to the afterlife. However, expanding the chiral network, humanity going extinct, and your contributions to the world just being destroyed by timefall, and even just being finished with the game someday, that's all inevitable. There's absolutely nothing we can do to stop the end from coming eventually, so we might as well just cut our connections to the beach, stepping out of our own heads where we worry about the end, and continue being alive while we still can. When Sam finally learns the truth about Amelie, that she might have never existed in the mortal world, he learns that while she gives him the closest thing to a connection to the afterlife that he'll ever have, she meant nothing in the real world. She wasn't a true connection in the one level of existence that Sam knew for certain he would get to experience. She's nothing but a pretty concept in his head that keeps him going over the course of the game. A life that Sam lived for Amelie would be one without any meaning in the real world, an idea that never came to fruition. It's around this point that Sam recognizes that, and decides that he needs to find meaning in his mortal life, not in his best shot in an afterlife. Suddenly, his aphosphosphobia goes away. He can be touched again.
There's something I need to tell you. Huh. This doesn't bother you anymore? Well, that's great!
He finally accepts Fragile's offer of cryptobiotes. He not only forgives Hardman, but he gives him advice about leading the country.
Wanted me to do this. To keep on being Hardman.
No. He didn't. Nobody wants a president who acts like they're immortal. And if you're not scared of death, how can you value life? And life is pretty fucking fragile right now.
And we even see him give Deadman one last hug before he hits the road. In true Kojima fashion, it's what our main character does at the very end of the game that's colored my whole analysis of it. Sam destroys his cufflink and takes BB out of the pod. What does the cufflink represent? Well, it's a connection, but it isn't a connection directly to other humans in the mortal world. It's a connection to the chiral network, to the beach. It and BB are the last connection to the world of the dead that Sam has. By destroying the cufflink and taking BB out of its pod, removing its connection to the beach, Sam completes his transformation into someone who's going to truly live his mortal life, and not spend it worrying about his death. He's shown who he really is to the people around him, and he's learned that even without a soul, a mother, a father, or a beach of his own, he's living a meaningful life. And suddenly it doesn't matter if humanity's eventually going to be destroyed, himself along with it. Death is only a fear if you haven't yet truly lived. If you've spent your life living in a way that you've confirmed was meaningful, then you can die a happy man. While most of the other characters don't necessarily have to worry about that, seeing as they know for a fact that they have an afterlife waiting for them after death, Sam spent the entire game holding tightly to this false connection to the afterlife that he'd been born into, and in the end he finally learns to let that connection go, and focus on the only life that he's certain he'll ever get to live. At this moment, he steps out into the rain with Lou, and he doesn't face the accelerated aging of Timefall. He doesn't have to spend his life in fear of the passage of time anymore, because he's finally lived. It's also at this point when we see our first rainbow that has blue in it. As Deadman believes, blue is the color of death. In breaking himself and Lou from their connection to the beach, Sam has restored, in his own mind at least, the sanctity of death. He's given it back its mystique, and so he has cause to truly live his life. This of course holds religious meaning too, and I feel like that's been the elephant in the room this whole time. If someone is truly religious, and their religion says that heaven is waiting for them, they should have no fear of death. However, I would argue that nobody is so religious that doubt never hits them. Sure, there might be an afterlife awaiting us all, but we just can't be certain about it. If we were able to demystify death and learn that yes, there was indeed a heaven waiting for us, we would have no cause to truly live our lives. But since we can't be sure of what happens when we die, every second of our mortal lives should be spent not worrying about what happens after, but enjoying it. This is why the mystique of death is arguably the most important part of life. It's what drives us to enjoy it, make connections with other people, learn what makes you and the rest of the world tick, so that when we someday have to face the inevitable, we can do it knowing that we made the most of what we were given.
Not scared of death, how can you value life? And life is pretty fucking fragile right now.